Hello, I'm James Riley. Welcome to the Bridging the Cyber Divide webinar series brought to you in partnership between InnovationAus and the Permissions Access Management Specialist, the cyber firm CyberArk. This is episode 1, Securing the Digital Economy, and today we'll be talking to Robert Deakin, the Director of Cybersecurity at the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, and with Thomas Fikentscher, Regional Director of CyberArk. Welcome, Robert, and welcome, Thomas. Robert, I'm going to start with you. We're going to start with a very broad question. It probably sounds ridiculously broad, but when we're talking about the digital economy, and we know that this government has focused a lot of attention on building a digital economy, what are we actually talking about? I think there was a tendency some years ago to equate digital economy somehow with e-commerce, but it's way more than that, isn't it? So what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think there's an exponential change in what the digital economy actually means, or data actually means, or the information age actually means. In the past, I think e-commerce was more like the bridges, specific pieces of transport infrastructure. And then I think over the last, maybe since the release of smartphones, people have started to realise there's a whole ecosystem around the transport network, if I keep using this analogy. But really, this next phase we're entering is not about where you're going, what car you're in, what plane you're in, but why are you going? What's it all about? What do we use data for? How do we perceive the world? How to react to it? How do we apply resources to it? So the digital economy is moving much further up that data pyramid, from data, information, knowledge to wisdom at the peak. And people are beginning to realise that data in itself doesn't have any particular virtue, and neither does wisdom. So it's that whole construct, and I think there's intellectuals who talk about it in a very, very broad metaphysical sense, and then there's engineers who talk about it in bits and bytes and rowhammer bugs and very specific things. So it's everything and nothing. It's like love, hate, war and peace, and I think we're on a journey to really discover what it is, depending on your perspective.
Okay, and look, I guess even the term digital economy and everything we meet around it has huge implications, obviously to people's daily lives. There are technical implications around how we design the frameworks that will drive it, and there's regulatory implications about how we develop that society that we want. So to Thomas, given as we said earlier, huge emphasis on digital economy by this government. There were a year ago, I think this month or last month, the federal government issued its digital economy strategy, and there are a bunch of budget measures in October in that strange post-COVID budget. So when we look at that big picture, are we ready here? From a regulatory standpoint, from a technical standpoint, from a skills standpoint? How's Australia tracking to implement this in the way that we want?
Yeah, good question. And I think every day when you open the news feeds and newspapers, you hear another announcement around digital economy and the importance of it, and especially when you're coming out of COVID. This is obviously the new mantra right now. But there is also a question around intent, which is absolutely there, the intent to basically have a leading role globally in this space versus the capabilities. And I think there has been, I think it's the Harvard School, it's the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. They actually had this sort of study around National Cyber Power Index 2020 in Australia. An interesting position because they looked at 30 countries, and Australia was fairly high up on the intent, which I think 8th place, but the capability was 16th place. So there is a divide between what we're trying to do, what we want to do, but what we can do. And I think when you look at capability, the problem is around, is there enough people with the skill sets in country? So in other words, do we have a domestic cybersecurity industry, for example, that can actually surround the whole digital transformation necessities? That's a skill set topic. Do we actually have the ability to commercialize ideas here and send them to other foreign markets and create a business out of that? So there are questions around that, and I think there are big issues that need to be tackled here. So again, intent is good, very positive, but capabilities are questionable at this stage.
Okay, and I guess certainly from a government perspective, in terms of the amount of effort to build digital government services and to drive that side of things, I guess the intent certainly is there. What do you make of that, Rob Deakin?
Look, Australia is in a brilliant position if we can harness the will, and the capability can follow, and that's a historical precedent. Once you get the will, it can happen. So if you look at other nations like Israel or Estonia, who've had sort of existential pressure on them, and they have adapted and they've built digital economies. And Israel, for example, has a strong export economy in cybersecurity. But there is certainly short, medium, and very long-term trends and factors. We're a $1.6 trillion economy. I think the government's about a quarter. I think their budget base is about 470 billion. We spend 35 billion on defence, but we're spending considerably less on cyber. So even the 200 or 300 million that we give to entities within Home Affairs or other is really small when you compare with the economy and where value is generated. If you look at where the government gets its value from, taxpayers pay about $220 billion into the government. Is that money coming back to protect them as consumers in the cyber world? Businesses get 87 or say we're 90 billion coming in. Are they getting money back to protect them? That's the other 3/4 of the economy. And is the government providing the resources back into that and to position us in the future? And we are in a very good position because we have strong institutions, which is a key factor in the way the world is happening now. If you look back historically to the Middle Ages or other periods where people have had trust, whether it was the Quakers or the various traders in the Mediterranean, they were able to make enormous fortunes because disparate communities could trust them. And Australia is in a position to be trusted. And the third factor, so I suppose the first factor is a middle power. We actually have potentially the balance sheet that we could do it. The second one is really that opportunity. The third one is Australians surprisingly trust their government. Right, so about 76% of people trust the government. We might not like this government or that government, but in general we think the government will. So we actually have the ability to harness ourselves as a nation to do things that authoritarian states can do because they have a level of trust, but not a different type of trust. But other nations like Britain and the UK have demonstrated are struggling to harness their national power towards that future.
All right. Well, let's explore that just a little bit. Just before I go to you, Thomas, Robert, can we, from a regulatory perspective, we sort of arrive at a time in history where tech giants are more powerful than ever. Even in the heyday of IBM, I don't think they wielded the kind of broad economic power that they do today. From a regulatory perspective, when we look across things, as disparate as privacy to the use of data to consumer data rights, have we got the rails in place, or is this a work in progress?
It's everybody everywhere is making it up as they go along. From Beijing to Mogadishu. So we like others are having a crack at it. But Australians have a crack at it. We don't need permission from people to do things, but we're also very pragmatic. So all that is needed is to make sure that constant pressure to improve the integrity of our organisations is a civil discourse around it. And I think we're sort of we could almost get there. We're almost having civil discourse. I think it's much worse than a lot of people would like, and they don't want backroom boffins discussing it. But shifting some of the agendas that are talked about towards the middle, and this podcast goes towards doing that, getting people talking about some of these fundamentals, not about fashionable things of the day, but fundamentals of how geoeconomics works, the pressures that are on us, and why strong institutions are important. And therefore, we're having a good crack at it. We're putting things in place. We're leading with CDR, for example, and lots of other initiatives the government's taking. But it's a constant give and take between the different agendas.
Okay, so Thomas Fikentscher, I'm going to ask you pretty much, the similar questions. Are we ready for this? But I wanted to, given that you're operating in this space and have been, for a good part of your career, given the pace of the rollout of connected devices or just, connected parts of the economy, it would seem every different layer adds another layer of complexity. Is that a reasonable assumption? Are things becoming so complex that we will find it difficult to pull back?
I certainly believe they're becoming increasingly complex, and it's a multidimensional problem that you're actually running into. We talked about the more technology you use, the more you need the skill sets behind it to basically master the technology. And technology itself is not sometimes easy to use in many ways. I mean, we're trying to improve user interfaces and making it simpler, but behind those nice, shiny interfaces, there's a lot of complexity that you have to deal with. But I mean, the next problem is there are so many interfaces now coming into play, and we all use multiple apps. We're trying to have wearable devices. We have sensors everywhere that actually somehow collect data. And then the next thing, which has to do with digital transformation, is integration, right? So we're trying to connect things. We're trying to connect systems everywhere, and those systems not always managed by the same people and not adhering to the same standards. So that's a level of complexity. Around that is the data management piece. Who is collecting data? When and where? Are you supposed to use them? Are you allowed to use them for certain purposes? So there's another problem in that particular space. So privacy rights and privacy protection. Policies that you have to set, regulatory compliance for certain industries that you have to look into. So there's, as I said, it's multidimensional. And from that perspective, it doesn't get easier. I think there's many industries who are trying to push ahead, and they're trying to actually transform. But once they go into that space, they realize, oh, okay, we haven't thought about this, we haven't thought about that, so we can't go at the speed that we thought we could. So yeah, it's complex.
So let's just drill down into that a bit. I know that you've got some interesting ideas within the construction sector of use of digital twins and doing interesting things in terms of that transformation. But just, Thomas, can you just give me some examples of where industries in Australia have done some interesting things, where we potentially have some kind of, if not competitive advantage, certainly some kind of a will to get things done, and where we're lagging?
Yeah. So you mentioned the construction industry. It's an interesting one. People believe still it's like, hands-on, brick and mortar, very physical. But I think that has changed a lot. If you look at progressive organizations in Australia and overseas, what they're doing, they're actually building a lot with data. They're building what they call digital twins before they physically build a building. And I always use the term, when you look into some of those new high-rise buildings or office buildings, you actually walk into a vertical computer, because in there everything is full of sensors, recognition systems. You might walk into a meeting room, and the meeting room recognizes who you are, so it recognizes your identity because there is a camera or a scanner somewhere. And then with that comes access to a screen, and that displays certain information. And it's all great, right? So it's because it's all user interfaces, and it's easier for us to do our job. But at the same time, do I want that? Do I actually, has someone asked me whether they can take a picture of my face? Has someone asked me whether actually, I want to have certain services provided to me automatically? So that's the challenge. I think there's a lot of interesting technology developments, but as I said to you, we also need to think a little bit harder around what that means from a individual consent model, privacy model perspective. And it's happening in pretty much all industries. Construction is one of them. The financial services industry has tried to provide improved user experiences, easy access to services for many, many years. But as I said, the trust and the privacy and the consent model is a very important one.
So, Robert Deakin, I guess we're still talking on the regulatory side of things, but I'm very interested in the use of, well, in particular, digital ID. I mean, there was a time in this country when the notion of a digital ID was seen as such an invasive invasion of privacy, or potential invasion of privacy, that it mobilised forces against it. But really, ID is kind of a fundamental to how we will work in the digital economy.
And there's so many different types of identity. I mean, you have an identity when you go to the coffee shop. The person might not know your name or whatever, but you have a presence and some credibility and attributes that the barista, sorry, being a Melbourne person, of course I have to use that example, knows you, all right, versus a machine identity versus something you've seen before, you don't know what it is, and then obviously your personal identity, and there are attributes that can't change. It is complex, but I need to sort of, suppose, challenge the framing of these things as being complex and hard, because they aren't. Having been a grumpy old engineer for 30 years, and having had multiple breakdowns trying to deal with the cosmic horror of cyber security, I've now really moved to a point of epiphany, realizing that most of the muggles just don't care, right? And the issue isn't the complexity. So if you go and use the products that Thomas has, or many of the others leaders have, the problem is solved, right? The problem is the complacency and the adjustment of people to the change. So no one's attacking us specifically at the moment with kinetic weapons, but pensioners on the Gold Coast are being romance ransomware. So have we got the balance right in terms of where we're putting our effort? And so have we got the balance right in relation to identity? My experience has been that people have already traded away their privacy and identity for convenience. We have a hope in Australia that we could provide the convenience with the appropriate checks and balances, which I don't think they would ever get in some other countries. In some nations, that identity and privacy has been taken away by techno-authoritarian states with no choice. So I think there's 2 points here. The complexity can be solved, the identity issues can be solved, the security can be solved, but it costs, and the issue is the cost, not the complexity, and embracing that, and then seeing, and therefore, what are the benefits for people, and people who are aware of the sorts of progress that some of the techno-authoritarian states have made with privacy invasion, and the incredible things that are there if they were used with more virtue, could be of great benefit. But they need governance and strong institutions so people can trust them.
So I guess we can always make things secure. I mean, you would probably agree as an engineer, you can lock things down, but it becomes so impossible to use and create so much friction. It's kind of less than ideal. So it really is.
Well, when people tell me they've got zero, when people say they've got zero risk tolerance, I say, good, I've got an infinite budget, right? It's always a balance. But they're the questions. Is not the technology is somewhat of a distraction. The brilliant engineers around the joint can solve this, but there are things that we need to trade off to solve those.
So Thomas, you must make you feel good that you've got a ringing endorsement, if not, of.
Well, they're a well-established player, right? So they've already got their street cred.
That's right. If not CyberArk specifically, then technology more generally. Well, what do you make about this issue of balance between reducing friction and making things more secure, but also reducing friction and still protecting things that we value, like personal privacy and personal information?
I think Robin made a valuable point. He said problem is solved. I mean, problem technology wise, yes, we have a lot of technology available, and it's probably a lot of technology, enough technology to solve immediate issues. I agree with that. But at the same time, there's also a question of risk appetite. Risk appetite at a corporate level that organizations have. How much risk am I prepared to actually go into? And yes, there's a balance between the amount of money you're going to spend on, securing everything versus, okay, I might have a very low probability to actually run into a cyber breach that is material for my business. So there's a trade-off there. I agree with that. But at the same time, I think there is also a lot of organizations that actually haven't even done the basics. So we can talk about risk appetite, but they probably don't even know what they're exposed to today. And I've seen that a lot. And I think that's a problem because we talked about digital economy at the beginning, right? If you look at critical infrastructure in Australia, you look at things like water supply, electricity supply, you look at traffic systems, public transport, ports. I mean, there's lots of critical infrastructure, and if that gets disrupted, seriously disrupted, that is a problem. And I think the risk appetite for things like that should be very low, because they're called critical infrastructure for a reason. So yeah, we have to I understand the balance and understand the availability of technology, but I also believe that in some organizations it's underestimated how big the problem is.
Can I ask?
And I think we're saying, go on.
No, go on, Rob.
So I think again, I'm agreeing, but I'm coming at it from a different perspective. So it's the human factors of risk management and risk taking. So in hardcore engineering, where you're doing failure mode analysis, and there's very structured engineering stuff when you're building an electricity plant or pumps and water or gas system or something like that. Engineering and risk management in that area is so different from the way risk management is handled in cyber, and it is still stuck in this archaic risk likelihood treatment, new risk, which does not work for engineering applications. It might work for decisions around HR or even some broader OH&S stuff. But if you're talking to an explosives engineer at a mine around how they do engineering and the systems, and so we are lagging fundamentally in the security domain around risk management and things, even words like risk appetite, they're still engineering stuff. They're not the things that have been talked about in the corporate box at the cricket games. Secondly, on top of and the lack of engineering risk management is coupled with the human factor of executives with 20, 30 years experience in their particular industry, and they don't recognise the step change, right? They're like Montezuma, totally unaware that Cortez is coming.
Okay, well,
and so us as when we do all this boffin talking, they just hear blah 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 acronym. It's never happened in the past, and so some of them are waking up. But we need to move from a situation now where we've just got a win-lose dynamic. We just lose, right? To at least lose. Which I think sort of focus to lose-win. Fundamental shift in strategy.
So let me ask, we haven't spoken about COVID, we haven't spoken about the pandemic. I think it's kind of seems universally agreed that COVID has acted as an accelerant on digital transformation, or certainly the appetite for transforming things. Is there a bill yet to be paid in some of the work that's been done in the last 6 or 9 months in accelerated rollout plans of digital systems?
I think it's the opposite, right? So COVID gave us a glimpse of Cortez coming over the horizon. And it actually broke complacency in a number of points at the macro level. So telehealth, a few things like that. It showed the government and the community, oh, hang on, the government can tell you to stay in your house and people will. Like there's fundamental shifts like that. So maybe we could do some other things for the greater collective good rather than the individual pursuit, because the individuals who are making value out of it aren't sharing that wealth. I mean, that's the inequality gap that everyone's railing about around the world. So it's highlighted a lot of gaps in systems, in trust, in different ways in different communities. And cyber's had some great uplifts, and some other shockers. With I think you had Chris on talking about all the problems with COVID attacks previously.
What do you think, Thomas? You're someone who gets around the industry. You're talking to a bunch of customers on any given day. Where are we up to?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call because we've been forced to do things differently, right? Again, we're coming back to digital transformation, people using digital services, but now they're using them from different environments. So in the past, you might say, okay, as long as you're in a certain environment, my office building and my secure network, you can access certain services and it's all fine. But now overnight, we're shifting people into their home offices. And I keep saying no one is really an expert in securing their home routers and really managing the settings in a perfect way. So all of a sudden, you actually access these same services or critical services from different environments, which completely shifts the game. So the architectural models need to change. People need to think about how they actually think about delivering services with security in a completely different context. And Robert mentioned things that,
I would challenge that again, right? I would say they don't need to think about it. That's the wrong framing. What we need to do is trust the experts. Right, and that's the problem. The problem is a structural problem is that you're not allowed to have an opinion on how the Optometry Association should do eye testing. The Optometry Association would do that, but there isn't, because cybersecurity has failed to protect the community, that we haven't built enough trust where they just go, okay, the wizards will do it for us, and we will trust that they will do it. Right, because the last thing I rail against security awareness because it doesn't help telling people they're under attack. Right? What helps is an actual solution or a mechanism or something they can specifically do, they can subscribe to, or they can click on. And the problem go on.
It's a bit of a to be fair, it's a bit of a movable feast in terms of the.
Well, it's a classic Red Queen gambit, right? So it's the Red Queen situation. You have to keep running as fast as you can to stay where you are. Right? Okay, and that's what hasn't been recognised, I don't think.
I'm going to start drawing this to a close. I wanted to sort of finish up with a comment from both of you, just in terms of the digital economy, and progress that's being made towards the integration of all those different systems across the economy that we need to do. Are we optimistic about how this is now progressing? What should government be doing more of in this space, and what should they stop doing? I'll start with you, Thomas. What do you think?
Well, short answer for me is I am optimistic. I start with being a citizen who uses government services myself. I think it's great to see that we actually having simplified services right now that I can use from my mobile device. I can do them very quickly. I don't have to bother to go to an office. I think that's positive. I think at state level there's lots of initiatives in that space. If you look at public transport and the improvements around public transport, how you pay for it and things like that, there's lots of stuff that has changed, and I think I'm positive about it. What I would say is that in some cases, people need to think a little bit harder around, especially in my industry, around the security elements of that. Because if something happens, and we had things happening in service NSW is a good example where breaches happen and data gets lost. That's where my trust is diminished, right? And then I'm getting a little bit reluctant and say, I'm not going to sign up for that service. Maybe I'm not going to sign up for a digital identity that the government or Australia Post is offering me. So I think that's where we have to do a little bit more work and a bit more structure and maybe communication. But overall, I'm positive. I think it's moving in the right direction.
And Robert Deakin, what are you, just to round out this conversation?
Look, I think if there was one thing to get people to meditate on, it would be that trust doesn't scale. I know only Sith deal in absolutes, but trust doesn't scale. And what I mean by that is the way that humans interact at a sort of a lower social level doesn't work as you get systems of systems of systems. And therefore, we need things that help us develop trust at higher levels. So whether that's various types of identity, various types of secured systems, various types of certifications, better risk engineering, is all those additional mechanisms that we need to put on top of normal human way of trusting a repeated pattern of predictable behaviour. That doesn't work when you're getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and adding then billions of devices. So think about whether what do we need to help scale trust and a digital economy, because it doesn't scale using normal human sort of psychology.
All right. Hey, look, thank you very much, Robert Deakin, Director of Cybersecurity at the ACCC. Very much appreciate you joining us on this Bridging the Cyber Divide webinar series. And thank you also to Thomas Fikentscher, Regional Director at CyberArk, ANZ. I think it's been a great discussion. I think there's going to be plenty more of them as we move forward with this. Thank you again.
Thank you. Excellent.
My pleasure.